Simple is an odd word when it comes to video games. Many of us crave the simplicity of the arcades, where all we had was our own skill with a stick and a button or two to get us through. But equally, the accusation simplistic can suggest a lack of depth and something quick to bore players who have an ever-increasing variety of alternatives to distract their attention. That Grand Brix Shooter from Korean developers Intragames is simple is incontrovertible. But is it that old-school simplicity that masks hidden depths? Or is it just a polite way of calling the game that far less ambiguous word, basic? Well, I'll be honest, at first I thought it was going to be the latter. But the more I've played of the game, the more I've come to enjoy it, and the more I've come to find subtle depth in its initially shallow appearing systems. The game is, as you can see, a hori. It follows a very basic structure of having 10 stages with a boss fight at the end of each. You have a forward shot and a special shot, which can be charged up through 3 levels of effectiveness by simply defeating enemies. Your shot also levels up through 3 stages, and this occurs by collecting the yellow stars dropped by certain enemies. You can take 3 hits before dying, although hit points can be recovered by switching between weapons. There are several different main shot types to be found throughout the game, each with an accompanying special, and the way you switch between them is where this game's subtle depth comes from. Now, in most reviews, I and most others like to give scoring a separate section, but in Grand Brix Shooter, that's almost impossible. See, the shot pickup mechanic and the scoring mechanics are so inextricably linked, they have to be talked about at the same time. So at the top of the screen, you have a points multiplier. This goes up by decimal points as you defeat enemies and will reset to 1 anytime you take a hit. In most stages, defeating everything would probably add up to a multiplier in the teens or 20s. However, each time you replace your main weapon with a new one, your shot multiplier doubles. In some stages, there can be around 4 chances to switch shots, leading to multipliers leaping up to about times 200 and giving you the opportunity to rake in massive scores if you can survive. And surviving will be more difficult if you do go this route, since each time you pick up a new shot, your power level drops back down to level 1. This brings a huge risk-reward factor, not just to the decision of whether to pick up a new weapon, but also to precisely how and when to pick it up. The higher your multiplier before you pick up a new shot, the more you have to be doubled when you do make the switch. However, if there are popcorn enemies buzzing around the screen, a quick switch may make more sense, as it'll give you a chance to level up before arriving at the boss. But then you also have pickups appearing during boss fights. Take one of those and you can potentially send your multiplier and end of stage payoff through the roof. But of course you're going to have to face the later stages of the boss fight with a weak weapon. Are you confident you can do that? Remember, take a single hit and that multiplier drops back to 1. When you've worked your way up to a times 100 multiplier and have a fully powered shot, are you really going to gamble to get a 200 multiplier when the potential punishment is effectively losing the whole thing? What about if the shot type you're switching to is better than the one you have though? Or what if it's worse? These questions are constantly fluttering through your mind as you play Grand Brix Shooter, especially when you're playing for score. And with the size of those multipliers, your choices can make a huge difference. It is easily possible to get a score from the first 2 stages alone that is higher than an almost complete 10-stage run when playing purely for survival. And by the way, the weapon switching mechanic also has a role to play in survival runs, since each switch recharges your health. But again, you have that choice of keeping going with a max powered weapon, maybe one of your favourites, and a lower health bar, or grabbing a new shot and the insurance of full health, but the inconvenience of a weak, possibly less effective shot type, and the risk that not being able to take out your enemies quickly enough will lead to you taking more hits than you would have with your favourite weapon. It's a really clever system, and one that only really starts to show its true depth after you've played the game multiple times. Speaking of which, there are 2 main ways to play, an arcade mode and a challenge mode. Arcade mode, more accurately a story or console mode, takes place across 10 stages and allows you to continue from the start of the most recent stage after dying with your score intact. Challenge mode does not, and is therefore more suited to score chasing, and is probably more accurately a kind of arcade mode. Now, challenge mode also has an extra system in which you are given small stat buffs at the end of each stage, which will last until the end of your run. There are, of course, leaderboards for each mode, but unfortunately, and despite claims to the contrary on the eShop, they are local only. A weird little thing with arcade mode is on hard you can leave the game and come back to whatever stage you were last at, but this is not available in the casual mode. I have no idea why this is, since you can still restart a stage as many times as you wish, and can be a bit of a frustration if you're stuck on a late boss and want to close the game or play something else for a while. On casual, the game is not overly difficult. Some sudden patterns during boss encounters can feel pretty tough, borderline unfair the first time you see them, but with a bit of practice and memorization, there's nothing here that should be insurmountable to most players. It is bosses that always offer the toughest part of each stage, with the run-ups, which are of highly variable lengths, usually being fairly easy affairs. There are also a lot of other reasons to keep playing within an in-game achievement system, and a gallery of all the different weapon types found throughout the game. Coming to visuals, rather oddly, the game employs three quite different aesthetics, with one in particular being completely unrelated to anything else in the game. The first is the backgrounds. These have a washed out kind of watercolory feel to them that's reminiscent of indie darling Green. I actually really like the style of these, especially when you start each stage, although it's a shame they don't progress in any way as you move through each stage, ending instead with a sudden change to a black background for each boss fight. Now the ships and enemies are done in a rather different style, with almost polygonal shapes, and weirdly they do actually mesh quite well with the backgrounds, despite their differences. There isn't a huge amount of variety in enemy types, however, with even bosses mostly looking kind of samey. Something I really do love though are the colours and appearances of the various shots, a lot of which have an almost neon crackle to them, and when there are lots on screen, and particularly during boss encounters, offer up a real pyrotechnic kind of laser light show effect. This does go too far on occasion, however, and especially when switching shots, some of the light effects can obscure other incoming bullets, leaving your position and the trajectory of enemy bullets immediately surrounding you obscured. Now, I said there were three aesthetics, and the third is related to the game's story, and is, in the context of the rest of the game, just weird. Every third stage you're treated to a little bit of a story about a child and his robot friend exploring some dream kingdom of which he seems to be some sort of amnesiac former ruler. What this has to do with the goings-on of the game itself is very unclear, and the fact the visual style is so completely different doesn't help matters either. These drawings aren't badly done in any way. They just look like they're for a completely different and unrelated game, and have a tacked-on feel that's not helped by the lower intermediate English of the translation of a story that seems more suited to a 12-year-old's creative writing homework than the plot of a shmup. Honestly, these sections are so jarring, I'd prefer if there were no story whatsoever than these incoherent interludes. Very hard to understand what they're doing in the game. Sound is another area in which I initially misjudged the game. Effects are decent but pretty standard fare, but the music has a cool chiptune vibe to it that fools you with its simplicity at first, but quickly worms its way into your brain and, like the game itself, becomes more and more enjoyable the more you play. Now, if you hadn't heard of Grand Brix Shooter before this review, that's not terribly surprising. The game's eShop page looks budget, shovelware-ish, and Intragames, for reasons known only to their PR and marketing team, which, to my great surprise, they apparently do have done almost nothing to promote the game. And this is really a big shame because people are missing out on a deceptively solid little shmup. The weapon switching system gives the game its own unique character, and while it certainly is a fairly simple title, I've found it to be so in the positive aspect of that word, and I think it's well worth giving a shot. It's not perfect, and at times it can have a lower budget feel, but I'd still be happy giving it a strong recommendation and a score of 8 out of 10. As ever, let me know your opinions if you've played this one. It's available on all eShops, I believe, and is well worth a look. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Cheers.